September 13th, 1942. Early morning. The western edge of Stalingrad lay under a low haze of smoke and dust drifting from the Volga. General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the German Sixth Army, reviewed reports showing steady progress. His divisions had crossed the Don. Soviet resistance appeared disorganized. The city ahead was shattered, exposed, and seemingly within reach. To Paulus and his superiors, the logic was straightforward. German armies had broken stronger defenses before. Urban combat was costly, but temporary. Once Stalingrad fell, the Volga would be cut, Soviet logistics in the south would collapse, and the campaign would resume its momentum. Nothing in the situation suggested catastrophe. What Paulus could not see was that the battle unfolding in front of him was no longer about terrain, tactics, or courage. It was about capacity, and the balance of that capacity had already shifted. Friedrich Paulus was not a reckless commander. He was methodical, cautious, and deeply professional. A staff officer by training, he had spent years immersed in operational planning rather than battlefield improvisation. His rise through the German army reflected competence, discipline, and loyalty, not flamboyance. The Sixth Army he commanded was among the strongest formations Germany had ever assembled. Over 250,000 men, supported by thousands of artillery pieces, armored units, and experienced officers hardened by years of fighting across Europe and the Soviet Union. By the summer of 1942, it had crushed opposition in Ukraine and advanced hundreds of kilometers eastward. German doctrine still rested on principles that had delivered victory repeatedly since 1939. Concentration of force, aggressive maneuver, relentless pressure. Enemy formations, once encircled or broken, were expected to collapse. This logic had worked in Poland, France, and the early stages of the invasion of the Soviet Union. Even after setbacks in the winter of 1941, German commanders believed that renewed offensive action would restore control. Stalingrad, in this view, was not an existential gamble. It was a stepping stone. Paulus had no reason to believe otherwise. The assumptions he operated under were not fantasies. They were conclusions drawn from years of success. Stalingrad itself did not appear formidable in September 1942. The city stretched along the Volga River for nearly 40 kilometers, but was narrow, industrial, and poorly suited for defense in theory. German air power had reduced much of it to rubble. Factories burned. Housing blocks collapsed. Entire districts ceased to exist. Yet the terrain created by destruction altered the battle in subtle ways. Rubble eliminated long sight lines. Craters replaced streets. Buildings became fortresses. Movement slowed to meters per day. Weather added another constraint. Dust and smoke choked visibility. Autumn rains turned open ground into mud. Supply routes, already strained by distance, became unreliable. German logistics had been stretched thin long before Stalingrad. Rail lines ended far to the west. Trucks consumed fuel faster than it could be delivered. Spare parts, ammunition, and replacements arrived late or not at all. But these problems were familiar. German armies had endured logistical strain before and continued advancing. Paulus believed Stalingrad could be taken before winter forced a pause. On paper, the situation remained manageable. That paper, however, did not account for what the Soviet system was preparing beyond the city. When German units entered Stalingrad, they expected the Red Army to break under pressure. Instead, Soviet resistance intensified. Soviet commanders abandoned traditional defense lines and adopted a doctrine that later became known as hugging the enemy. They fought at point-blank range eliminating German advantages in artillery and air power. Factory workers were armed and sent directly into combat. Reinforcements crossed the Volga at night under fire, replacing losses as quickly as they occurred. German assaults gained ground, but at enormous cost. Units were consumed in grinding attrition. Every block captured required repeated attacks. Every advance triggered counterattacks. What appeared chaotic was, in fact, procedural. Soviet forces did not seek decisive engagements. They sought delay. Every day, the Sixth Army remained locked inside the city was a day it could not maneuver, withdraw, or reinforce its flanks. German command interpreted this resistance as desperation. It was not. It was allocation. Behind Stalingrad, Soviet industry continued operating beyond the Urals. Factories evacuated in 1941 were producing tanks, artillery, and aircraft in growing numbers. New armies were forming far from the front. Reserves accumulated quietly. The German Sixth Army was fighting the visible enemy. The invisible one was assembling elsewhere. By November 1942, German positions in Stalingrad were overextended. The Sixth Army held a narrow urban corridor along the Volga. Its flanks were protected by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian units with limited equipment and mobility. Paulus reported these vulnerabilities. The response from higher command was confidence. Soviet forces, exhausted by months of fighting, were believed incapable of large-scale offensive action. This belief was based on outdated assumptions. On November 19, 1942, Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus. The attack did not strike Stalingrad itself. It struck the flanks. Within days, Axis defensive lines collapsed. Soviet armored units advanced rapidly through weakly held sectors, exploiting numerical superiority and operational depth. By November 23, the encirclement was complete. The Sixth Army was surrounded. Paulus now commanded a force trapped hundreds of kilometers inside enemy territory. Supplies dwindled immediately. Ammunition was rationed. Fuel disappeared. Casualties mounted. The system that had sustained German advances could no longer function. At this point, the battle entered its decisive phase, not through combat, but through arithmetic. German command promised to supply the encircled Sixth Army by air. Calculations showed that at least 600 tons of supplies per day were required to maintain combat effectiveness. The Luftwaffe could deliver a fraction of that amount under ideal conditions. Winter eliminated those conditions. Aircraft were grounded by weather. Airfields were captured or destroyed. Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns inflicted losses that could not be replaced. Each transport plane lost reduced future capacity. Meanwhile, the Red Army tightened the encirclement. New units rotated into position. Artillery concentrations increased. German forces weakened with each passing day. Paulus requested permission to break out. The request was denied. The Sixth Army was ordered to hold its ground. Holding required resources the system could no longer provide. By January 1943, the Sixth Army had ceased to exist as a functional force. Units were reduced to fragments. Soldiers suffered from starvation, frostbite, and disease. Command structures collapsed as communication failed. Paulus was promoted to Field Marshal on January 30, 1943. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. The implication was clear. 2 days later, Paulus capitulated. Over 90,000 German soldiers entered captivity. Fewer than 6,000 would return home. Stalingrad was not lost because German soldiers lacked courage, nor because Paulus lacked intelligence. It was lost because Germany attempted to fight a modern industrial war with a system designed for short, decisive campaigns. The Soviet Union absorbed losses that would have destroyed any traditional army and replaced them continuously. It traded space for time, casualties for production, and cities for systems. Once the Sixth Army entered Stalingrad, its fate was sealed not by bullets, but by logistics, capacity, and scale. In modern war, defeat does not always arrive suddenly. Sometimes it arrives the moment a system commits itself to a problem it cannot sustain. Stalingrad was lost long before the surrender. It was lost the moment Germany chose to fight a war of endurance with a system built for speed,